The highway was empty at 11:47 p.m. when the red and blue lights appeared in Lena Marlowe's rearview mirror. She pulled over without argument. She was wearing scrubs. She was tired. She had nothing to hide. 40 seconds later, she was face down on the asphalt with a bullet in her shoulder, her hand still raised, her ID still inside her pocket. The officer standing over her would later tell his supervisor she had lunged at him. He would say she was erratic, aggressive, dangerous. What Officer Brett Calloway did not know, what nobody in Harwick County would know until it was far too late, was that the woman bleeding on that road had once kept soldiers alive under enemy fire in conditions he could not survive for 10 minutes. He thought he had neutralized a threat. He had no idea what he had started. And before this story goes any further, if you've ever watched someone get knocked down and quietly wondered whether they'd get back up, stay with me. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The last patient Lena Marlowe treated that night was a 7-year-old boy who had swallowed 3 of his grandmother's blood pressure pills. His name was Marcus, and he had done it on a dare from his older cousin. And when Lena leaned over his gurney and told him he was going to be just fine, she meant it with the same flat certainty she used for everything. No performance, no sweetness layered on top, just the truth delivered cleanly. The boy's mother cried. Lena handed her a paper towel from the dispenser on the wall because the tissue box was empty again, and she made a mental note to tell the charge nurse, and then she forgot about it. The moment she walked out of Bay 4 because there were 2 more patients waiting and her feet had stopped hurting somewhere around hour 9, which she had learned long ago meant she was running on whatever came after, tired. Kettner Memorial Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Harwick, a mid-sized city in the kind of flatland geography that made distances feel deceptive. You could see the water tower from 3 miles out, but the drive always took longer than it looked. The ER at Kettner wasn't the worst Lena had worked in, but it wasn't well-funded either. The supply closet ran out of basic items on a rotating schedule. The overhead lights in Bay 2 had been flickering for 6 weeks. The break room microwave smelled like someone had heated fish in it sometime in 2019, and no one had properly dealt with the aftermath. Lena had stopped using it. She clocked out at 11:31 p.m. and changed out of her second set of scrubs in the locker room. The first set had taken a splash of something she preferred not to identify around hour 4. She pulled on a gray hoodie, black sweatpants, her worn-down running shoes. She looked, she knew, like someone who had been awake too long and was deeply uninterested in conversation, which was accurate. She texted her neighbor Diane to confirm the dog had been walked, got a thumbs-up emoji in return, and pushed through the side exit door into the parking lot. Her car was a 2009 Civic, the color of old moss, with one rear hubcap replaced by a different model and a small crack in the passenger side mirror that she'd been meaning to get fixed since March. She got in, started the engine, let it run for 30 seconds, the way the mechanic had told her to in cold weather, and pulled out of the lot onto Mercer Road heading west. She was 15 minutes from home. She had done this drive hundreds of times. She knew the lights, knew the left turn at Danner where the signal ran long, knew the stretch of Route 9 that went dark past the grain facility because the county hadn't replaced the road lamps after the storm 2 winters ago. She drove it on autopilot, the radio on low, some late-night call-in show she wasn't really listening to, and she was thinking about nothing in particular, which was the only real rest she got most nights, when the lights appeared behind her, red and blue, close and sudden in her rear view. Lena checked her speed. She was doing 34 and a 35. She signaled and pulled onto the gravel shoulder without hesitation, cut the engine, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. This was habit. This was something she had learned to do so long ago, it wasn't even a conscious decision anymore. Hands visible, posture neutral, no sudden movements. She waited. She heard the car door, heard the boots on gravel. The flashlight hit her side mirror before it found her face. License and registration. The officer was young. She could tell that before she even turned her head. Maybe 26, 27. The voice was doing that particular thing that young men in authority sometimes do when they're not sure of themselves, pitching itself lower than it naturally sat, adding weight it didn't quite earn. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing the dark uniform of the Harwick County Sheriff's Department. His name tag read Calloway. "Of course," Lena said. "My registration is in the glove compartment and my license is in my jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for them." Hands on the wheel. They are on the wheel. I'm letting you know before I move. I said hands on the wheel. The flashlight moved to the interior of the car, sweeping across the back seat, the passenger side. Step out of the vehicle. Lena paused. Can I ask what I was pulled over for? Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. The ma'am landed like a flat stone. Not hostile exactly, but dismissive. The kind of word that reduced a person to a category and moved on. Lena registered it and filed it away and did what she was told. She opened the door slowly, kept her hands at shoulder height as she stepped onto the gravel, and stood facing the car with her back to Officer Calloway. Turn around. She turned. The flashlight was directly in her eyes now. You've got a broken taillight, he said. Lena said nothing. She had replaced both taillights in September. She knew this because she had done it herself in the parking lot of the auto parts store on a Saturday afternoon, because the mechanic quoted her $160, and she found a YouTube tutorial that made it look straightforward, and it had been. I wasn't aware of that, she said. You weren't aware. He said it like the words meant something else, like awareness itself was suspicious. He looked her over. The hoodie, the sweatpants, the worn shoes, the old car. Something shifted in his posture. A small relaxation, the way people sometimes relax when they decide they're not dealing with anyone who matters. Where are you coming from? Work. I'm a nurse at Kettner Memorial. I just finished a 12-hour shift. You got ID? In my jacket pocket, left side. I'll get it slowly. She reached with her left hand, 2 fingers, the way you'd reach for something in front of someone who was nervous. She had done this before. Not with police, but with people who were frightened and holding things. And the principle was the same: slow, visible, deliberate. She was pulling the edge of her wallet out when Calloway's hand shot forward and grabbed her wrist. Don't move. I'm getting my ID. You asked for my ID. I said don't move. His grip tightened. He was pulling her arm back and she was turning with it because the alternative was a broken wrist. And in the turning, her shoulder came up and she heard him say something sharp into his radio, and then everything happened in a compression of moments that her brain would spend weeks trying to sequence correctly. She heard the word weapon. She heard herself say, I don't have a weapon. She heard the second car on the gravel, lights cutting across the road, and then she was on the ground. Her knee hit first, then her palms, and she was saying, my hands are empty, with the side of her face against the asphalt. And she heard the shot the way you hear a car backfire in a parking garage, too loud and too close and wrong in a way that your body understands before your brain catches up. The pain came a half second after. Her left shoulder, high up near the joint. Not burning the way people described, more like pressure, enormous and sudden, like something had tried to pass through her and hadn't quite finished. She kept her hands flat on the ground. She did not move. She heard Calloway's breathing, fast and uneven above her, and she heard the second officer, a woman, she thought younger, saying something she couldn't make out, and she heard herself, from somewhere that felt oddly distant, say, I'm losing blood. I need compression on the entry wound. If you don't apply pressure in the next 2 minutes, I'm going to go into shock, and you're going to have a very different kind of problem. Nobody moved. I'm a trauma nurse, she said. I'm telling you exactly what is happening to my body. Apply pressure. Now. There were things about Kettner that Lena had never told anyone, including the colleagues she ate lunch with and the neighbor who walked her dog and the one friend from back home who still called on her birthday. She had not told them because the information was not relevant to her present life, and she did not believe in explaining herself to people who hadn't asked. She was private not out of trauma, but out of habit, a preference for clean lines, for keeping compartments separate, for not importing context from one part of your life into another where it didn't belong. What she had not told anyone was that before Kettner Memorial, before the flickering lights in Bay 2 and the microwaved fish smell and the 12-hour shifts with Marcus and his grandmother's blood pressure pills, before all of that, she had been Staff Sergeant Lena Marlowe, 75th Medical Brigade, attached to a special operations support element that operated in environments that did not appear on the official deployment schedules. She had been doing this work since she was 22. She had done it in places where the nearest actual hospital was an hour away by helicopter, assuming weather allowed, assuming the bird wasn't already committed somewhere else. She had done chest seals and needle decompressions with her hands shaking from cold, had packed wounds with whatever was available, had talked men back from the edge of consciousness in languages she'd taught herself phonetically, so she could at least say, "Stay with me. I have you. Don't close your eyes." She had been good at it, not in the inspirational way, not in the way that made a good story, but in the practical way that meant people lived who probably shouldn't have. She had 2 commendations and a unit citation and a medical discharge she did not discuss, and she had come back to civilian life and gotten licensed and found the job at Kettner and shown up every day for 3 years without once making it anyone else's business. She had wanted to disappear into something ordinary. She had managed it, more or less, until tonight. The ambulance took 11 minutes. She knew because she counted, not deliberately, not as a coping mechanism, just because her brain had been trained to track time and she couldn't turn it off. The second officer, whose name she later learned was Priya Okafor, had finally knelt beside her and applied pressure with her own jacket, hands shaking slightly, and Lena had talked her through it calmly and without judgment, because Okafor was clearly frightened and frightened people made bad pressure wrong, and this was not the moment for mistakes. Calloway had stepped back. He was on his radio, voice low, and Lena caught fragments, not compliant, and appeared to reach and secured the scene. And she filed those fragments away too, the way she filed everything, because her mind was doing what it had been trained to do under stress: observe, categorize, preserve. She was loaded into the ambulance at 12:08 a.m. The paramedic who took over from Okafor was competent. She could tell from his hands, from the way he moved, from the order in which he worked. She answered his questions when they asked them and stopped volunteering information when she realized it wasn't helping her stay calm, which was the actual priority right now. She had a through and through in the deltoid region. She was 90% sure. She could move her fingers, which meant the brachial plexus was intact, and the blood loss was significant but not catastrophic if they moved quickly. She knew this. She held the knowledge at a slight distance because knowing the clinical details of your own injury was a peculiar kind of useful that could tip toward useless if you let it make you too analytical about your own survival odds. The hospital they took her to was Kettner Memorial. She almost laughed at that. Almost. The ER at Kettner after midnight was the ER that Lena knew best. Quieter than days, but with its own kind of pressure, because the staff was reduced and whatever came through the doors had to be handled with less. She recognized the lights before the gurney stopped moving, recognized the smell, recognized the crack in the ceiling tile above Bay 3, which she had been looking at from the other direction for 3 years. She did not recognize the face of the surgeon who leaned over her, which made sense. She was on the evening rotation primarily, and surgery had its own world that she interfaced with but didn't fully inhabit. "I'm Dr. Sadie Voss," the woman said. She was 50 or so, gray at the temples, with the kind of voice that had been giving instructions in high-pressure rooms for a long time. "Lena, can you hear me?" "Yes." "I'm going to take care of you. Do you understand what happened?" "GSW to the left shoulder, high deltoid, I believe through and through. Significant blood loss. No neurological deficit that I can detect in my hand function. BP is probably sitting around 90/60. A pause. "You're a nurse." "Your ER. Bay 2 light still flickering." Another pause, shorter this time. Voss looked at someone Lena couldn't see and said something quick and low. And then they were moving and the ceiling was sliding past, and Lena let her eyes close for the first time since the gravel. She came out of surgery at 4:17 a.m. The through and through assessment had been correct. The bullet had passed through the posterior deltoid without hitting the joint capsule or any critical structures, which Voss told her later with a specificity that suggested she'd looked up exactly what she was dealing with and wanted Lena to know she'd been thorough. There was muscle damage. There would be rehabilitation. The shoulder would not be the same for at least 6 months, and possibly longer depending on how the scar tissue settled. Lena absorbed this information the way she absorbed most information, without drama. What she absorbed less cleanly was the news that came an hour later, delivered by a Harwick County deputy named Sumner, who sat in the chair beside her bed with a notepad and the careful manner of someone who had been given a script he wasn't comfortable with. Officer Calloway had filed his report. The narrative was what she had expected from those fragments on the gravel shoulder. She had been uncooperative, had made a sudden movement toward her jacket with what the officer had perceived as threatening intent, and the discharge had occurred in response to a perceived threat. "He says you lunged," Deputy Sumner said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I was retrieving my identification," Lena said, slowly, with 2 fingers, after verbally announcing my intentions twice. Sumner wrote something, or pretended to. The notepad didn't move much. Were there any other witnesses? Officer Priya Okafor was on scene. She arrived immediately after the shot. Right. Another non-note. The body camera footage is being reviewed. Lena looked at him steadily. She had an IV in her right arm and a blood pressure cuff that was cycling every 15 minutes, and her left shoulder was packed and wrapped. And she was flat on her back in a hospital bed in her own workplace. And she looked at this deputy with his uncomfortable script and said, very evenly, "Whose camera?" "Excuse me?" "Calloway's camera, or Okafor's camera." "Both cameras are being reviewed." "Right," Lena said. She said it the way Sumner had said right, as a word that held information it wasn't releasing. Sumner left 20 minutes later. The night nurse who came to check her vitals was a woman named Bev, who had worked at Kettner for 11 years and knew Lena well enough to work in silence, which was exactly what Lena needed. Bev adjusted the IV drip and checked the dressing and said, "Holler if your pain gets above a 6. And Lena said she would, and they both knew she probably wouldn't, and that was fine. She lay in the dark for a while after Bev left. She thought about the fragments she'd heard on the gravel. Not compliant, appeared to reach. Secured the scene. She thought about the way Sumner's pen hadn't moved. She thought about both cameras are being reviewed and what that meant when it was said by someone who was visibly uncomfortable and had been given a script. She had been in situations before where the official account and the actual account diverged. Not with police, but in other contexts, institutional contexts, where something had gone wrong and the institution's first instinct was containment. She knew what that looked like from the outside. She knew what it looked like from the inside too, which was a different kind of knowledge. She was not naive about what was happening, but she was also not, she told herself, going to do anything about it tonight. Tonight she was going to let her shoulder heal and let her blood pressure stabilize and let her brain rest. Because she had learned a long time ago that the worst tactical decisions came from the period immediately after a trauma, when everything felt urgent and nothing was clear. She closed her eyes. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known from that hospital bed at 4:52 in the morning, was that 38 miles north, in a sheriff's department annex that smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, a man named Captain Dylan Rourke was listening to his subordinate explain the situation with the particular kind of controlled patience that people use when they are deciding how much of a problem something is going to become. Rourke was 53. He had been with the Harwick County Sheriff's Department for 27 years, the last 9 as a senior captain overseeing patrol operations, which meant he was intimately familiar with the ways that patrol operations could go sideways, and the ways that sideways could become manageable, and the ways that manageable could become, if you weren't careful, something else entirely. He had navigated several of these situations over the course of his career. He was good at it. Calloway was young, which was both the problem and the advantage. Young enough that his instincts weren't reliable. Young enough that he had panicked on a dark road and done something that couldn't be undone. But also young enough, and green enough, and lacking in enough prior record that there were ways to frame this if the frame was installed quickly and correctly. "Tell me about the nurse," Rourke said. "She works at Kettner, ER, 3 years. Clean record, no priors, nothing on file." And before that? His subordinate, a lieutenant named Garver, who had been with the department for 12 years and knew how these conversations worked, paused in a way that told Rourke the answer was going to be complicated. "Before that's thin," Garver said. "Military service. Ends about 4 years ago. Medical discharge. And the details are, they're sealed. Like actually sealed. Not just administrative sealed. We can't pull the file." Rourke looked at him. "What branch?" he said. "Army. That's all we've got." Rourke was quiet for a moment. He had dealt with veterans before. Most of the county had some military connection. It was that kind of place. And he had dealt with sealed records before, and he was smart enough to understand that sealed was a category with a range. Some sealed was bureaucratic. Some sealed was something else. "Get Calloway's report locked down," he said finally. "I want the dash cam footage from his unit logged as corrupted by morning. Okafor's camera went dark. Equipment malfunction, she'll be advised. And I want this framed correctly before the union gets involved and makes it messier," Garver wrote. This time his pen moved. "What about the nurse?" he asked. "She's sedated in a hospital. We'll have time." What Rourke did not know. What he could not have known, in that annex with its bad coffee smell, making his careful calculations, was that 3 states away, a man named Major Cole Adler had just received an automated notification from a monitoring protocol that he had never expected to actually trigger. The notification was tied to a flag in a database that most civilians didn't know existed. It was tied to a name, and the name was Lena Marlowe. Adler read the notification once, put down his coffee, and picked up a different phone. Not the one on his desk, the other one. The one that lived in his jacket pocket and had a very short contact list. He had served with Lena Marlowe for 3 years in conditions that had required them to trust each other with things that couldn't be written in any report. He knew her history. He knew what she was capable of. And he knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent years operating in environments where instinct was data, that Lena Marlowe did not end up shot on the side of a road in Harwick County by accident. He made his first call at 5:04 a.m. By 5:09, 2 more calls had been made. By 5:15, a name had been put on a list in an office that Rourke had never heard of and would not find comfortable to learn existed. In her hospital bed at Kettner Memorial, Lena Marlowe lay with her eyes closed and her breathing measured, and her left shoulder packed tight, and the IV cycling quietly. And the only outward sign that she was not simply resting was the way her right hand stayed flat on the mattress beside her, fingers loose. The way a person keeps their hands when they have learned that stillness is not the same as surrender. She had been underestimated tonight. She had been shot and lied about and left on the gravel and brought to a hospital in a county where someone was already deciding how to make her story smaller. They had done this to the wrong woman. But she didn't know yet, lying in that bed, that the machinery that had been set in motion in a jacket pocket phone call at 5:04 a.m. was already moving faster than Rourke's careful containment plan, and that the sealed file he couldn't open was about to be opened by people with very different authority for very different reasons, and that what it contained was going to change the shape of everything that came next. The machinery that had been set in motion at 5:04 a.m. did not look like much from the outside. It looked like a man in a hotel room 3 states away making phone calls before sunrise. It looked like an email chain that copied people whose names didn't appear on any public organizational chart. It looked like a request for records access that went through 4 layers of clearance before anyone at the receiving end was authorized to even confirm the file existed. Major Cole Adler was not a man who moved loudly. He was 41, lean in the way that came from years of irregular meals and high-output days, rather than any particular discipline about it, with the kind of face that defaulted to unreadable. He had commanded medical support operations in 3 different theaters, and had learned early that the people who made the most noise in a crisis were rarely the ones who resolved it. He had also learned, in those same years, that the systems designed to protect soldiers sometimes needed to be pushed from the inside before they would move, and that pushing required knowing exactly which levers existed and in what order to pull them. Lena Marlowe had been one of the best medics he had ever served with. Not in a way he had told her directly, because that was not how either of them operated, but in the way that mattered. He had asked for her by name on the 2nd rotation, and then the 3rd, and when the medical discharge came through and she'd processed out quietly without any fanfare, he had made sure her service record reflected every commendation she was owed, because he knew she wouldn't push for it herself. He had not expected to be making calls about her before dawn on a Tuesday in November. He worked through his list methodically. The first call was to a CID contact at Fort Lassiter who could pull the monitoring flag details and confirm what had triggered it. The second was to an attorney he knew in Washington who specialized in cases where military personnel, active or discharged, became entangled with civilian law enforcement in ways that raised federal questions. The third was to a man named Sergeant First Class Ray Thibodeau, retired, who had been Lena's direct team sergeant for 2 of those 3 years, and who Adler knew would want to be told before he heard it anywhere else. Thibodeau said very little on the call. He said when and how bad, and what do you need from me, in that order, and Adler gave him the answers he had and said he would call again when he had more, and they hung up. By 6:30 a.m., Adler was in his car, heading toward Harwick County. In the hospital, Lena slept in fragments. Not deeply. She had never been a deep sleeper, even before the Army, and the Army had finished off whatever capacity for unconsciousness she'd had by training her body to surface at the slightest auditory shift. The IV pump had a cycle rhythm. The floor outside her room had a specific pattern of foot traffic. Nursing checks every 40 minutes, the medication cart around 6 o'clock, the early morning housekeeping pass that always skipped the rooms with patients and just did the hallway. She cataloged these things without deciding to, the way you breathe. Her shoulder hurt. She had declined the stronger pain option when the night nurse offered it at 3 a.m. because she needed her head clear, and she was managing the discomfort the way she managed most physical unpleasantness, by acknowledging it was there and then giving it a very small portion of her attention. This was a skill that took years to develop and was completely useless at explaining to anyone who hadn't developed it. At 7:14 a.m., Dr. Voss came by on her morning rounds. She was direct, which Lena appreciated, and covered the clinical update without inflation. The shoulder was stable. The muscle damage was consistent with what the imaging had shown. There was no vascular compromise. And barring infection or complications, she was looking at a minimum 5-day admission for monitoring and the start of a structured rehab protocol before discharge. She also said, in the same even tone, that there had been a representative from the sheriff's department asking about Lena's status at the nursing station earlier that morning. Asking what specifically? Lena said. When you'd be lucid enough to provide a formal statement. Lena considered that. What did you tell them? I told them you were a trauma patient in my care and that the timeline for any formal interviews would be determined by your medical condition. Voss paused, and something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of deliberate steadiness. I also told them they'd need to go through hospital administration for any further inquiries, and that administration's office opens at 9. Thank you, Lena said. That gives you until 9, Voss said, and left. Lena spent the next 40 minutes doing something she was good at, thinking without moving. She lay still and let her mind work through what she knew, what she could reasonably infer, and what she needed to know that she currently didn't. The report Calloway had filed, she was certain of its shape now. She had heard him on the radio and she knew how these narratives were constructed because she had been in enough institutional environments to understand how the story gets written in the first 90 minutes and how hard it becomes to rewrite it after that. The body camera footage that was being reviewed, she had spent enough time around operational debriefs to know that reviewed was the word used when the outcome of the review was being managed rather than discovered. And Deputy Sumner's notepad that never moved, that was someone who had been sent to gather information about her, not document it. She understood what she was dealing with. What she was less certain about was what resources she had, and from what direction they were going to come, and how fast. She did not know about the calls Adler had made. She did not know he was in a car heading toward Harwick County. She did not know that a formal inquiry request had already been filed through channels that moved at a different speed than anything the county sheriff's department was prepared for. What she knew was her shoulder hurt and her position was precarious, and the institution that had shot her was currently working on the story. It was going to tell about why. She also knew she had survived significantly worse, and that surviving worse had never once required her to panic. Captain Dylan Rourke arrived at his office at 7:45 a.m. and found Garver already there, which was either good or bad depending on what Garver had to say. It was bad. The dashcam footage from Calloway's unit, Garver said. He set a folder on the desk without sitting down. It's not corrupted. Rourke looked at the folder without opening it. You said, I know what I said. Someone already pulled it. Evidence log shows it was accessed at 6:12 a.m. and logged into the secure evidence system. Chain of custody's been established. Who pulled it? That's the thing. Garver finally sat. He looked like a man who had been awake too long and found something he wasn't expecting to find. The access request came through an interagency portal. Not internal, not county. The authorization code on the request. I ran it, and it doesn't resolve to anything in our system. It's a federal prefix. Rourke was quiet for a long moment. The camera that was supposed to be malfunctioning, he said. Okafor's. Same. Already logged. Same authorization code. The room was very still. Through the window, the county road outside was just beginning to pick up its morning traffic. A delivery truck. A school bus running early. A pickup with a cracked taillight that was probably fine and would never get pulled over because it was moving through a part of town where people didn't get pulled over for cracked taillights. Find out who filed that access request, Rourke said. His voice was level. He was good at level. I need a name and an agency, and I need to know what they're looking for and why. I've already got someone working on it, Garver said. But Dylan, if this is federal, we need to— I know what we need to do, Rourke said. Get Calloway in here. I want him in this office before 10 o'clock. Garver left. Rourke sat alone and opened the folder and looked at the dashcam image stills that had been printed as part of the evidence log notation. There were 12 of them, pulled at intervals. He looked at the still that corresponded to the moment of the discharge, the one that showed a woman in a gray hoodie with both hands clearly visible at shoulder height, her body turned sideways, nothing in her hands, a wallet just beginning to emerge from her jacket pocket. He closed the folder. He was not a man without conscience. That was something he had told himself for 27 years and largely believed. He was a man who had made a calculation and was now looking at the part of the calculation he had gotten wrong, which was the assumption that the gap between what happened and what was documented could be managed with enough institutional authority and enough time. The footage existed. Someone with federal access credentials had already secured it. The gap was no longer manageable. The question now was a different kind of calculation. Officer Priya Okafor had not slept. She had gone home at 3 o'clock a.m. after her shift ended, and she had sat in her car in her own driveway for 17 minutes before she could make herself go inside. And then she had sat at her kitchen table and not slept. She was 24 years old and had been with the Harwick County Sheriff's Department for 14 months, which meant she had a probationary period that technically ended in 6 weeks, but effectively never ended because probationary periods established a dynamic that took years to actually dissolve. She knew this. She had been told this, indirectly, by 3 different senior officers in 3 different ways: a warning about the union, a comment about seniority, a piece of advice about keeping your head down in your first year that was delivered as mentorship but landed like something else. She had kept her head down. She had been good at her job, or tried to be, and she had filed her reports accurately and shown up on time and not made trouble. She had told herself that was enough. She had spent the night at her kitchen table looking at her body camera footage on her phone. She had her own copy because she had downloaded it before anyone could advise her otherwise, a decision made in the 3 minutes after the ambulance left, when she was standing on the gravel shoulder alone, and something in her head said, "You need to have this." And she did not stop to analyze whether it was policy compliant, because the thing in her head was louder than policy. The footage showed what it showed. It was 17 seconds long, starting from when Okafor had jogged from her unit to Calloway's position, and it showed Lena Marlowe face down on the gravel with a wound in her left shoulder and her hands flat and open on the asphalt. And it showed Calloway standing over her with his weapon holstered and his radio at his mouth. And it showed Lena's voice, captured clearly because Okafor had been close enough, saying, "I'm a trauma nurse. Apply pressure. 2 minutes before shock. You need to move right now." The footage also showed something that happened in the 4 seconds before Okafor reached the position, captured at the edge of the frame because of the camera angle. It showed the very end of the sequence before the shot. Lena's hands, clearly raised, the wallet partially extended, Calloway's body moving forward. Okafor had watched this footage 11 times. She had not called anyone. She had not filed a supplemental report. She had sat at her kitchen table and looked at it and understood, with the clarity of someone who was young enough to still be shocked by things, exactly what had happened and exactly what was being constructed around it. At 8:47 a.m., her phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was from outside the county. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Officer Okafor," said the voice on the other end. Male, calm, with an efficiency of delivery that made her sit up straighter without deciding to. "My name is Major Cole Adler. I'm currently 40 minutes outside Harwick County, and I need to speak with you before I reach the Sheriff's Department. I understand you were on scene last night." A long pause from Okafor's end. "How did you get this number?" "I have access to resources that let me find information quickly when someone I served with is lying in a hospital bed. I'm not calling to pressure you. I'm calling because I think you already know what happened, and I think you've been sitting with it since last night, and I think you need to know you're not going to be alone in this." Okafor looked at her phone screen. Then she looked at the frozen image on her kitchen table, the laptop screen, the footage, frame 11 of 17 seconds. "What do you know about her?" she said. Her voice was careful, not hostile, testing. "I know she's the best trauma medic I've ever worked with," Adler said. "I know she got out 4 years ago and went back to being a nurse because she wanted something quiet. I know she didn't deserve to end up on a gravel shoulder. And I know whatever your department is telling you about last night is not what your camera shows. Silence. What do you need from me? Okafor said. What? The morning at Kettner Memorial moved the way. Hospital mornings did. The administrative machinery grinding through its early cycles, the day staff taking over from night staff, the announcement board in the lobby updating with the day's clinical schedules. The security desk at the main entrance logged a visitor at 9:03 a.m., a man in civilian clothes, medium height, with a federal identification that the desk officer looked at twice before logging it. The man said he was there to visit a patient. The desk officer made a call to the nursing station and then waved him through. He stopped at the nurse's station on Lena's floor first. I'm here to see Lena Marlowe, he said. She knows me. The charge nurse, an experienced woman named Patricia who did not rattle easily, looked at his ID again. She's awake. I'll let her know you're here. Don't, he said, but not rudely. She'll just tell you she doesn't want visitors. Just tell her it's Ray. Patricia looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the room and came back 30 seconds later. She says you can go in. He was Thibodeau. Retired Sergeant First Class Ray Thibodeau, 53 years old now, broad through the chest and with the kind of face that had been weathered by things most people didn't experience. He had driven 6 hours through the night, arriving at just after 4 a.m., and had sat in the hospital parking lot for 5 hours because he didn't know what else to do with himself while he waited for a reasonable hour, and because going home was not something he had considered once the call from Adler came in. He pulled the chair beside her bed and sat down without ceremony. Lena looked at him. You drove all night. Good driving hours, no traffic. Ray, you look terrible. I've looked worse. Yeah. He looked at her shoulder, at the IV, at the way she was holding herself. The controlled stillness that he recognized because he'd watched her hold it in far worse circumstances. You in a lot of pain? Some. Some means yes. Some means manageable. He nodded slowly. This was how they talked to each other. It had taken about 6 months when they first served together to arrive at a register that worked. Not warm, not cold, just direct, stripped of most of the social scaffolding that people use to cushion things. Once they'd found it, they'd stayed in it. It felt natural in a way that longer conversations with friendlier people sometimes didn't. Adler's on his way, Thibodeau said. He's got people moving. What kind of people? The useful kind. He pulled the monitoring flag before it had been active 3 hours. Lena absorbed this. He shouldn't have to be doing that. No, Thibodeau agreed. He shouldn't. Something moved across her face. Not grief, not anger, something that didn't have a clean name and lasted less than 2 seconds before it was gone. What does he know about the footage situation? He knows the county tried to bury the camera records. He knows they got into the federal evidence system first and logged both cameras before your department had a chance to pull them. He leaned forward slightly. Lena, someone on that scene copied the footage before the department advised otherwise. She was quiet for a moment. Okafor. Adler thinks so. He's meeting her this morning. Lena looked at the ceiling. The familiar ceiling of Bay 3 was a floor up and 50 feet in the other direction, and this ceiling had a water stain in the upper left corner that was new since the last time she'd been in this wing. She thought about Okafor's hands on the gravel, shaking slightly, applying pressure. 24, maybe. 14 months in. Had made an instinct call in a 3-minute window that was either going to define her career or end it depending on what came next. She needs protection, Lena said. Adler knows. Not after the fact, Ray. Now, before your department figures out she has the footage. I know. He took out his phone. I'm on it. He made 2 calls from the chair beside her bed, keeping his voice low, and Lena listened without appearing to and thought about the shape of what was happening. The county had moved to contain this within the first hour. They had the full institutional weight of a sheriff's department and a union and 27 years of established relationships, and they had moved with the confidence of an organization that had managed situations like this before. What they hadn't accounted for was the sealed file. What they hadn't accounted for was a monitoring protocol that triggered before sunrise and a man who had responded to it by driving all night and making 6 calls before 6 a.m. What they hadn't accounted for was the gap between nurse and scrubs in an old car and what was actually in that file. But Lena wasn't counting on the file. Files could be argued about. Access could be contested. The The file meant something, but it wasn't the thing that mattered most. What mattered most was a 17-second video on a young officer's phone. The meeting between Adler and Okafor happened in the parking lot of a diner 4 miles from the sheriff's department annex. Okafor arrived first and sat in her car until she saw a vehicle with out-of-county plates pull in and park, and the man who got out matched the description she had built from his voice. Controlled, efficient, moving like someone who had spent a lot of time in places where moving efficiently mattered. He got into her passenger seat. She handed him her phone without him asking for it. He watched the footage twice. He did not react visibly either time. "Do you have a copy backed up somewhere other than this device?" he asked. "3 places," she said. "One of them is not in this state." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but a particular kind of assessment. The way you look at a person when they've done something that tells you more about them than a conversation would. "You've done this before?" "No," Okafor said. "But I watched someone I trusted tell me 4 hours ago that my camera experienced an equipment malfunction. So I thought about what that meant and worked backwards." Adler looked at her for a moment. "Who told you?" "My shift supervisor. She got it from above her." "And you didn't say anything to correct it?" "No." Okafor's jaw was tight. "Because I'm 24 and I'm 6 weeks from the end of my probationary period, and I know how this works. I know what happens to the person who corrects it out loud before anyone else is ready to hear it." "What happens to them?" Adler said. It wasn't quite a question. "They disappear from the department before anyone's finished filing the paperwork." She looked out the windshield. "I'm not saying I'm proud of the 6 hours it took me to decide. I'm telling you the truth about why." "I'm not here to judge your 6 hours," Adler said. "I'm here because what's on this footage is going to matter in a very specific way in the next 48 hours. And I need to know if you're prepared for what comes after you hand it over." Okafor turned to look at him directly. She looked like someone who had been awake all night making a decision and had arrived at the other side of it. "Tell me what comes after." "Your department is going to say the footage is incomplete, out of context, improperly handled. They're going to question the chain of custody because you downloaded it independently. There will be pressure on everyone who knows you. Not threats, probably, but the quiet institutional kind that's harder to document. And you're going to have to stand in front of people with more institutional authority than you and tell them exactly what you saw on that road and why you chose to preserve it." Okafor was quiet for a long moment. Outside the diner, a family was unloading from a minivan. 2 kids, a parent carrying a diaper bag, ordinary Tuesday morning. "She kept herself calm enough to tell my hands where to go," Okafor said. "She was shot and bleeding, and she coached me through applying pressure because I froze for a second, and she talked me out of it. While she was the one bleeding." She looked back at Adler. "I'm ready." Adler nodded. He handed her back the phone. "Keep it on you. I'm going to make some calls. Don't go into the department building until you hear from me." He got out of the car. She watched him in her mirror, already on the phone before he reached his own vehicle, and she thought about the woman on the gravel who had talked her hand steady, and she pressed her own phone against her palm and held it there, and she did not think about probationary periods or shift supervisors or the quiet institutional pressure that was coming. She thought about 17 seconds of footage and what it was worth. What she didn't know, what neither she nor Adler knew yet, was that 20 minutes earlier inside Kettner Memorial Hospital, a third-year resident named Dr. Marcus Fiore had been completing the surgical documentation from the previous night and had opened Lena Marlowe's intake record to add a notation and had found something tucked inside the sleeve of the physical jacket that had been bagged with her personal effects. It was a folded piece of identification. Military issue. Old enough to have been through the wash at least once. The laminate cracked at one corner. It had been missed in the initial intake because it was inside the lining of her hoodie, a hidden pocket she had sewn in herself, one of several habits from her service days she'd never quite shed. Fiore had unfolded it, read it once, and then set it on the counter and read it again. He was 29, a second-year resident, and he had grown up with 2 uncles who served, and he understood enough about military classification structures to know that the unit designation on the identification he was holding was not a designation that appeared on standard service records. It was not a designation that appeared anywhere publicly, as far as he knew. He stood in the intake documentation room and looked at it for a long moment, and then he called the attending, Dr. Voss. and told her she needed to come look at something in documentation before it got routed to administration. And when Voss came in and looked at the identification, she was quiet for longer than Fiore expected from a woman who was rarely quiet. "Don't log this yet," she said. "I have to log intake items within—" "I know what the protocol is," Voss said. "Give me 20 minutes. I need to make a call." She walked out of documentation with the identification in her hand, and Fiore stood alone in the room with the paperwork half completed, and somewhere above him on the third floor, Lena Marlowe lay in her bed with Ray Thibodeau in the chair beside her, neither of them knowing that the one piece of physical evidence that could unambiguously answer every question about who she was and what she had done and why it mattered, had just been found by someone who didn't yet understand exactly what they were holding, but understood enough to know it changed everything. Voss made her call from the documentation room's supply closet, which was the only space in that wing with a door that locked from the inside. She had worked at Kettner for 19 years, and she knew every functional corner of the building. The way you know a house you've lived in long enough that the quirks stop being quirks and just become the place. The supply closet smelled like antiseptic and old cardboard, and she stood between a shelf of gauze rolls and a box of expired catheter packaging, and she made a call to a number she had not dialed in 4 years. The man who answered was her brother-in-law, who had retired from the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps as a lieutenant colonel and now ran a small private practice in Richmond that handled military law and federal civil rights cases. His name was Warren Lyle, and he was meticulous and careful, and exactly the kind of person you called when you were holding something you didn't fully understand and needed to understand it fast. She described the identification. She read him the unit designation. Warren Lyle was quiet for 6 seconds. She counted. "Sadie," he said, "where is this ID right now?" "In my hand." "Do not put it back in the patient's file. Do not log it in administration. Do not tell anyone outside the immediate clinical team that you have it." A pause. "Is the patient stable?" "She's post-op, stable, alert. GSW to the left shoulder." "Is anyone from the sheriff's department in the building?" Voss thought about the representative who had been at the nursing station at 7 that morning. "There was someone earlier. I don't know if they're still here." "Find out. And Sadie, that unit designation. If I'm reading what you described correctly, that identification should not exist in a civilian hospital intake. The fact that it does is either a significant oversight on someone's part, or it's exactly where it was meant to end up." Another pause. "Either way, you need to know there are people who are already looking for her, military people, and they're going to want to know about this. How do I reach them?" "You may not have to," Warren said. "Give me 15 minutes." She came out of the supply closet and found Fiore still standing in the same spot, which told her he was either very conscientious or very frightened, and she told him to finish the documentation but leave the personal effects section incomplete and mark it pending verification, which was a legitimate procedural notation that would hold up to scrutiny if anyone checked. Fiore nodded, and she could see him storing questions he wasn't asking yet, which was the right call, and she appreciated it. She went back to her patients. She had 7 on her morning list, and 3 of them needed her more urgently than this situation did. And she could not let the situation consume her clinical function, which was a thing she had learned to do over 19 years. Hold parallel tracks without letting them bleed into each other. It was not comfortable. It worked. 12 minutes after her call to Warren, her personal cell buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Dr. Voss, Adler, Cole, Major, U.S. Army. I understand you have something that belongs to my medic. I'm 25 minutes out. Don't let it leave your hands." She read it twice, put the phone in her coat pocket, and went to check on her patient in room 7 who was recovering from a laparoscopic procedure and had been complaining about her IV site since 6 that morning, and she was thorough and present for that patient in the way she tried to be thorough and present for all of them. Because the alternative, letting the thing in her pocket pull her attention while someone in her care needed her, was not something she was willing to do. The IV site was irritated. She ordered it changed. She moved to room 8. Upstairs, Lena had gone quiet in the way Thibodeau recognized from operational context, not withdrawn, not shutting down, but pulling inward to process. He had seen her do it before 3 or 4 times when the situation changed faster than the available information could explain, and he had learned that the right response was to give her the space and stay present, because she came out of it with better analysis than most people produced in an hour of active discussion. He refilled her water cup from the pitcher on the side table. She didn't acknowledge it. He sat back down. After about 4 minutes, she said, "The ID." "What about it?" "I had it in the lining pocket, left side of the hoodie. It's been there so long I stopped thinking about it." She looked at the window. Gray morning light, a parking structure visible in the middle distance. If it ended up in the intake bag, someone found it. "Someone found it," she agreed. "Question is who and what they did with it." Thibodeau pulled out his phone. Before he could dial, it rang. Adler. He answered, listened for 90 seconds, said, understood twice, and how long once, and hung up. "Adler's got it," he said. "A surgeon found it. She called someone she trusts and Adler's already in contact. He's almost here." Lena processed this. The ID was a problem and an asset at the same time. It confirmed everything about her that made the county's narrative impossible, but it also exposed a layer of her history that she had kept sealed for 4 years and had reasons to keep sealed. And she was not sure she was ready to have that layer opened in a hospital room in Harwick County with a police department actively building a case against her. She had not chosen this. She had been shot in the shoulder and dragged into it, and the parts of her past that were coming to the surface now were coming on someone else's timeline. She didn't say any of this to Thibodeau because he already knew it. "The county's going to move soon," she said instead. "Rourke, whoever's running this, they're going to figure out the federal access on the cameras, and they're going to recalibrate. When they do, they're going to want to reframe the narrative before Adler can establish standing. Adler's already ahead of it. I know, but Rourke has home field and 27 years of relationships and a union behind him. Adler has federal authority and a sealed file and whatever Okafor is sitting on." She paused. "It's not a given." "No," Thibodeau said. "It's not." She looked at her left hand, the one on the side of the injury, and flexed her fingers slowly, full range of motion. The shoulder screamed at the movement, but the screaming was informational, muscle pain, not structural compromise. She would be on her feet before anyone expected her to be. She intended that. The lobby of the Harwick County Sheriff's Department Annex at 10:14 a.m. looked like it always did on a Tuesday morning. The duty sergeant behind the front desk, a waiting area with 4 plastic chairs that nobody was using, the glass-fronted display case with commendations and department photographs going back to the early 90s. The building smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax. The fluorescent light above the entrance had a barely perceptible flicker that everyone who worked there had stopped noticing sometime in the past year. The 3 vehicles that pulled into the parking lot did not stop at the visitor spaces. They pulled past them and arranged themselves across the front of the building in a configuration that was not aggressive but was very deliberate. 2 dark SUVs and a government-plated sedan, the kind of unremarkable federal vehicles that were specifically designed to look unremarkable and somehow never quite managed it. There were 4 people, none of them in uniform, though the way they moved said uniform as clearly as any insignia. Major Cole Adler walked through the front door of the annex at 10:17 a.m., with federal identification already open in his left hand, and a woman named Special Agent Dana Quirk from the Army Criminal Investigation Division at his left shoulder. Quirk was 43, compact, with short dark hair, and the specific quality of attention that investigators developed after enough years of walking into rooms where people were lying. She never looked at the obvious thing first. She looked at the edges. The duty sergeant stood. "Major Cole Adler, Army CID liaison," Adler said, presenting his credentials. "I need to speak with whoever is currently the senior officer on shift, immediately." The sergeant looked at the credentials and then looked past Adler at the 2 agents behind him and then back at the credentials and reached for the phone with the particular efficiency of someone who understands that certain things fall outside their pay grade. Captain Rourke came out to the lobby himself, which meant he had been waiting. He was in full uniform. Adler noted this, which was either habit or a decision. He was a big man, broad, with the composed face of someone who had been managing people for a long time and had developed patience as a professional tool. He extended his hand. Adler shook it. He was not hostile. Hostility was an inefficiency. "Captain Rourke, I'm here in connection with the shooting of Staff Sergeant Lena Marlowe, medical discharge, currently working as a civilian nurse at Kettner Memorial. I need access to the full evidence file on last night's incident, the personnel files for officers Brett Calloway and Priya Okafor, and a conference room for the next 3 hours." Rourke's expression didn't change. I wasn't aware this incident had a federal connection. You are now, Adler said. A pause. Rourke looked at Quirk, who was looking at the commendation display case with what appeared to be neutral interest. I'll need to contact the county attorney's office before I release. You can contact whoever you need to contact, Adler said. I'll wait in the conference room. The evidence request is filed through the interagency portal as of 6 this morning, so the clock on your response window is already running. He held Rourke's gaze. I don't need your cooperation to get what I came for, Captain. I'm extending you the courtesy of doing this with you in the room instead of around you. The lobby was very quiet. The duty sergeant had set down the phone and was looking at a point on the wall just above everyone's heads. Rourke said, "This way." They gave Adler the conference room that smelled like old coffee and had a whiteboard with incompletely erased notes from some previous meeting, budget line items, a district map, someone's initials in the corner. Quirk set her case on the table and opened it and began laying out the documentation in the specific order she used, which was her own system and which she had never explained to anyone because nobody had asked in a way that suggested they actually wanted to understand it. While Adler reviewed the initial evidence packet, the version the county had assembled, which told the story the county had decided to tell, Quirk was doing something else. She had the incident timeline in front of her and she was running her finger along it at points that didn't match, the small gaps and inconsistencies that accumulated when a narrative was constructed retroactively rather than documented in real time. Evidence logged out of sequence. A timestamp on Calloway's report that predated the ambulance arrival by 4 minutes, which meant he had filed it while a woman was still bleeding on the road he was standing on. A body camera, maintenance log that had been updated at 6:04 a.m. after the federal access request had already secured both cameras, but before the department would have known that. They updated the malfunction log after we pulled the footage, she said. Adler didn't look up from the report. I know. That's not cover-up, she said. That's evidence of cover-up. There's a difference. I know that too. Quirk made a notation. She was the kind of person who found institutional deception more interesting than she found it offensive, not because she was indifferent to it, but because the specifics of how it was executed usually told you more about the institution than any single bad actor did. The pattern here was practiced. This wasn't the first time Rourke had managed an incident in this manner. The question was how far back the pattern went, and whether Calloway was the latest iteration of something systemic or simply someone whose bad judgment had been enabled by an environment that absorbed it. 40 minutes into their review, there was a knock on the conference room door. The officer who entered was young, maybe 25, in uniform, and he had the look of someone who had made a decision and was not entirely comfortable with it, but had committed to it anyway. He said his name was Deputy First Class Owen Kessel. He said he was Calloway's partner on the previous shift rotation, not last night, but the 2 weeks before. He said he had been told by his shift supervisor not to discuss last night's incident with anyone from outside the department. But, he said, and then stopped and started again. There was an incident 6 weeks ago. Different stop, different road. Woman driving alone late night, nothing in her car. Calloway. He paused. She didn't end up in the hospital. She got scared and she drove away when he let her go, and she didn't file anything. But I was there, and I filed an internal report, and I need to know if that report is still in the system. Quirk looked at Adler. Adler looked at Kessel. Sit down, Deputy. Kessel sat down. His hands were on the table and they were not entirely still. If I'm wrong about this, if I'm misreading what's happening, you're not misreading it, Adler said. Tell me about the internal report. Calloway had been brought into Rourke's office at 9:40, and what happened in that room was not recorded and had no witnesses beyond the two of them. Rourke had worked for 27 years precisely to have the credibility and institutional weight that allowed certain conversations to happen in rooms without recording, and he was not a man who wasted that kind of capital on situations that didn't require it. This situation required it. He had told Calloway, and he chose his words with the care of a man who understood the specific weight of every word he selected in a room without recording, that the incident was being managed, that Calloway's report had been filed and would be supported, and that what Calloway needed to do right now was to say nothing to anyone outside the department and let the process work. He said this without making any explicit statement about what the process would produce, because explicit statements were unnecessary when the implication was clear, and clear implications in unrecorded rooms were exactly what Rourke had spent 27 years building the context to make. Calloway had listened with the expression of a young man who was frightened in a way he couldn't quite locate. Not of Rourke, but of the situation, of the scale of what he had done and what was now moving around it. "There's federal people in the building," Calloway said. "I'm handling it." "Priya hasn't come in." Rourke looked at him steadily. "I'm aware." "She had the backup unit. Her camera was logged as malfunctioning," Rourke said. Each word clear, deliberate, laid down like something that needed to stay where it was put. Calloway was quiet for a moment. I was 26 years old, and he had grown up in Harwick County, and he had wanted to be in law enforcement since he was about 14. And he had done 3 years with the department and had 17 commendations in his file and had been told by 4 different supervisors that he had a good career ahead of him. And he had believed it with the uncritical ease of someone who had not yet been tested in a way that revealed who he actually was. "What if her camera wasn't malfunctioning?" he said. The room was quiet enough that the HVAC system was audible. Rourke said, "Leave that with me." What neither Rourke nor Calloway knew at that moment was that Okafor was not in her home and was not coming in for her shift. She had, on Adler's instruction, driven to a location outside the county where she was currently sitting in a room with a federal attorney who was walking her through the process of providing a voluntary witness statement to the Army CID. She had her phone with her and the footage was on it, and 2 backup copies existed in locations that were no longer in Harwick County. And what none of them knew, not Rourke, not Calloway, not Adler, not Quirk, was that at 11:02 AE, Owen Kessel's 6-week-old internal complaint report was pulled from the department's internal document server by the federal access credentials, and what it contained was not just the incident report for the stop 6 weeks prior. It contained Kessel's notation that he had verbally reported the incident to his shift supervisor at the time, and the supervisor's name and the date, and a follow-up notation 3 days later when he had asked about the status of the report and been told it had been reviewed and found without merit. The shift supervisor's name in Kessel's report was Captain Dylan Rourke. Quirk read this without changing her expression. She underlined the name twice, slowly, with the mechanical pencil she used for document review, and she passed the printout across the table to Adler without comment, because commentary was not necessary. Adler read it, set it down. "This changes the scope," he said. "Yes," she said. "From one officer with a conduct problem to a department that's been managing conduct problems. That's what the documentation suggests." Adler was quiet for a moment. Through the conference room wall, he could hear the ordinary sounds of the department going about its morning. Radio traffic, someone's boots in the hallway, a door. People who thought they were still ahead of this. "I need to call the U.S. Attorney's office," he said. "I know." Quirk had already opened her laptop. "I'm pulling the full complaints database for this department going back 10 years. If there's a pattern, I want it documented before anyone in this building has time to identify what we're looking at." Lena was sitting up when Adler arrived at the hospital, which surprised him slightly, and he let it show because he had never been any good at pretending not to be surprised when he was. She had the bed adjusted to nearly upright, and she was in a hospital gown with her left arm in a soft sling, and she looked, he thought, like someone who was in genuine pain and was managing it through a very long-practiced discipline of not giving it any authority. Thibodeau was still in the chair. He stood when Adler came in, and they did the brief, specific greeting of men who had worked in demanding environments and didn't require a social ritual around it. Adler sat in the second chair, which someone had brought in at some point. "Rourke supervised the suppression of Kessel's complaint 6 weeks ago," he said. "He didn't ease into it because Lena didn't benefit from easing into. That means this isn't a single incident. It's a pattern with institutional cover from the top." Lena received this. Calloway had done this before. At least once that we can document. Kessel thinks there are others he doesn't know about. And Rourke knew. Rourke managed it, which is its own category of culpable. Adler looked at her steadily. "I want you to understand what this means for your case. This started as a shooting investigation. It's expanding into something broader. The U.S. Attorney's Office is being brought in. That's the right call, but it also means this is no longer something we can keep tight." "It was never mine to keep tight," Lena said. "I was shot on the side of a road. It was never my situation to manage." "I know that. I'm telling you because things are going to move fast. And I want you to know the shape of it before they move." She nodded once. She looked at the window, then back at him. "What about Okafor?" "She's safe. She's with federal counsel giving a voluntary statement. She's solid, Lena. She's been solid since 3 in the morning. She had backups of the footage before anyone told her she needed them." Something that was not quite a smile. "Good instincts. She said you talked her hand steady when she was on the scene. She would have been fine. Probably. But she said you did it." The room was quiet for a moment. Thibodeau refilled his own coffee cup from the insulated mug he'd brought because hospital coffee was a form of punishment he had decided years ago not to accept. "There's something else," Adler said. "The ID. Voss has it. She called me directly. Smart woman, good judgment, didn't log it to administration." Lena was quiet. "It's going to come out in the investigation anyway," Adler said. "The file. Everything. I want to manage how it comes out rather than let the county find it and use it to muddy the waters. I need your authorization to open the file and use it as part of the federal case." This was the part she had been waiting for, not dreading exactly, but aware of. 4 years of ordinary life, of Kettner Memorial and the flickering light in Bay 2 and Marcus and his grandmother's pills and Diane walking the dog, all of it balanced against the sealed thing that had produced her and then let her go, and that she had not looked back at because looking back was not how she was built. "Authorization," she said. "Formal written authorization, for the record." She thought about the gravel. Her own hands, flat, empty, raised. The shot. The way the sound landed wrong. Calloway on his radio, already constructing the narrative. Rourke in his office the next morning, doing what he had apparently been doing for years. Managing, containing, deciding which truth got to exist. She thought about whoever was next, if this was left to manage itself. "Yes," she said. "Open it." Adler reached into his briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. She signed it with her right hand, which was not her dominant hand, but the signature was clear. He was putting the paper away when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his expression shifted. Not alarmed, but recalibrating, the look of someone who has just received information that changes the weight of the next hour. "What?" Thibodeau said. Adler looked up. "Rourke just requested an emergency meeting with the county attorney. He's got union counsel with him." He paused. "And he's filed a request for the transfer of the shooting investigation to an independent state review board." Thibodeau frowned. "That's not a defensive move. That's trying to cut ahead of federal jurisdiction." "It is," Adler said. "If the state review board takes the case before we establish federal jurisdiction, we lose control of the evidence timeline." He was already standing. "I need to make 2 calls and get back to the annex in the next 20 minutes. He was moving toward the door when Lena said his name. He turned. "The Kessel complaint," she said. "If Rourke suppressed it, there are other officers who saw things and reported things and got the same response. Find them before Rourke figures out you have Kessel." Adler looked at her. "Already in progress." "Good." She settled back against the raised bed. "Go." He went. Thibodeau sat back down. The door swung shut. The room was quiet again in the specific way hospital rooms became quiet. A contained clinical quiet that had nothing to do with peace. Lena stared at the ceiling. Somewhere across town, in a building that smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax, a man who had spent 27 years deciding which truths got to exist was making a calculation that he believed would save him. And in a government building 2 counties over, a young officer was sitting across from a federal attorney and describing, carefully and in sequence, everything she had seen on a gravel shoulder at 11:47 p.m. The hands, the wallet, the shot, the blood, the woman's voice, steady and clear, talking her own crisis into something manageable. And in a server room that nobody in the sheriff's department annex had authorized anyone to access, a CID technical analyst named Brooke Varga was running a 10-year search of the department's internal complaint database against a set of parameters that Quirk had sent her at 11:09 a.m. At 11:47 a.m. Exactly 12 hours after the shot on Route 9, Varga's search returned 214 results. She looked at the number for a moment, then opened the results file, and the first entry had a date from 9 years ago and a name that was not Calloway. She picked up the phone. Brooke Varga's call went to Quirk first, because that was the chain, and Quirk listened for 45 seconds without speaking and then said, Send it to my secure terminal right now," and hung up and looked at the open laptop in front of her with an expression that Adler, walking back into the conference room at that moment, recognized as the one she wore when something was bigger than the initial scope, and she was already reorganizing the architecture of the case in real time. 214 internal complaints over 10 years, she said. Suppressed, dismissed, or reclassified. The earliest one is 9 years ago. Civilian complaint against an officer named Tate, who transferred out of the department 3 years later. The complaint was filed, reviewed by the supervising captain, and marked unfounded within 48 hours. No interview of the complainant, no body camera review because cameras weren't standard yet. Just closed. Rourke was supervising captain 9 years ago? Rourke was supervising captain 9 years ago. She turned the laptop to face him. The database search flagged 214 because I ran it broad. All dismissed complaints, all reclassified incidents, everything that got marked closed within the first 72 hours without a full investigative record. Not all of them are Rourke, but the ones with his name on the review signature, there are 63 of those. Adler sat down. He had been in enough federal investigations to know that the number 63 in this context was not just a number. It was a structural indictment. It meant that one bad officer on a dark road at midnight was the surface, and what was below the surface had been accumulating for almost a decade. The U.S. attorney needs to see this before Rourke's meeting with the county attorney concludes, he said. I've already sent the summary. Rourke closed the laptop. There's something else. 3 of the 63 complaints name officers who are still active in the department. 2 of them are senior deputies. 1 is currently the department's internal affairs liaison. The internal affairs liaison. The person whose institutional function was to investigate misconduct. Adler was quiet for a moment. Name. Deputy Commander Frank Selby. 12 years with the department, the last 4 in internal affairs. He's got 2 complaints in the suppressed file, both from his time on patrol before the IA appointment. Rourke signed off on both dismissals. Adler thought about this. Selby and internal affairs meant that any officer who had tried to escalate a complaint through internal channels in the past 4 years had been routing it through a man whose own file had been managed by the person he now theoretically reported to. The system had not merely failed, it had been built to fail in a specific direction, by specific people, for a sustained period of time. We need to move on Selby before he accesses the complaint database and realizes we're in it, Adler said. I've already had the access credentials frozen as of 7 minutes ago. She said it the way she said most things, without emphasis, because for Quirk, competence was not a thing that required announcing. He can't log into the system until we've completed the extraction. Rourke's meeting with the county attorney lasted 41 minutes. The county attorney was a woman named Judith Farrow, who had held the office for 11 years, and who had, over those 11 years, developed a very precise understanding of the difference between situations that were manageable and situations that only appeared manageable until they weren't. Rourke came in with union counsel, a man named Gerald Hoff, who wore an expensive suit and talked with the kind of smooth institutional confidence that came from years of making problems smaller than they were. Farrow listened. She was good at listening in the way that people who were deciding something listened, very still, very attentive, not interrupting because interrupting was a form of engagement and she was not ready to engage yet. Rourke made his argument for a state review board takeover with the practiced fluency of a man who had constructed the argument in the car on the way over. State review board moved slower. State review board had less authority than federal. State review board could be influenced through channels that federal couldn't. He didn't say any of this explicitly because he didn't need to. Farrow was not naive, and Hoff had certainly had this conversation before. But the logic was legible beneath the procedural language, and everyone in the room understood what was actually being requested. Farrow let him finish. Then she said, "The Army CID filed a formal federal jurisdiction claim at 11:23 this morning. I received the notification 7 minutes before you called to request this meeting." The room was quiet. "That claim supersedes the State Review Board request," she said. "I can't accept the referral, Dylan. The timeline is already federal." Hoff leaned forward. "The federal claim is based on the victim's military service history, which has nothing to do with the conduct of... The federal claim is based on a civil rights violation involving a former service member, supported by physical evidence including body camera footage and an independent witness statement, and it's been filed correctly, and I'm not in a position to contest it." Pharaoh's voice was even. She was not hostile, she was simply delivering information. "What I can do is advise you to cooperate fully with the CID investigation and consult with your union counsel about the department's exposure, which I would suggest doing as soon as possible given the pace things are moving." Hoff said something else. Rourke didn't fully hear it. He was running the calculation he had been running since 6 that morning, but the variables had shifted again, and the calculation was not resolving the way calculations were supposed to when you had 27 years of institutional capital behind you, federal jurisdiction, footage already logged, a witness in federal protective custody giving a voluntary statement, 214 complaints in a database he had built over a decade under the assumption that databases like that were internal and stayed internal. He did not know about the database yet. He found out 40 minutes later. Quirk delivered the notification personally, which was a choice, and Adler let her make it because she had built the evidentiary case and it was hers to present. She walked into the conference room where Rourke had been waiting. Hoff had gone to make calls, leaving Rourke with a deputy and a glass of water that had gone warm, and she set the printed summary on the table in front of him with the specific economy of movement that she used when she wanted someone to understand the gravity of a document before they opened it. Rourke looked at the cover page. He looked at the number in the summary header. He did not react. He was too experienced to react. But something changed in the room the way pressure changes before weather. Not visible, not dramatic, just a shift in the quality of the air. This represents a pattern of systematic suppression of civilian misconduct complaints spanning 9 years, Quirk said. The investigation is now formally a civil rights and obstruction case, not a single incident shooting investigation. The scope includes Officer Brett Calloway, Deputy Commander Frank Selby, and pending further review yourself. Rourke looked at Hoff's empty chair. "I'd like to wait for my counsel," he said. "Of course," Quirk said. "We'll be here." She picked up the summary and walked back out. In the hallway, she passed Kessel, who was still in the building because Adler had asked him to stay, and he had agreed without being told why. And she gave him a nod that acknowledged something without specifying it, and he returned it with the slightly dazed expression of a young officer who had done the right thing and was now discovering that the right thing had consequences he hadn't fully mapped. Lena found out about the database from Thibodeau, who got a text from Adler at 1:18 p.m. and read her the relevant section. She absorbed it the way she had been absorbing things all day, receiving the information, adding it to the structure she was building internally, adjusting the shape of what she understood. 214. 9 years. She had been shot at midnight on a Tuesday, and by the following afternoon the institution responsible for it was unraveling at a scale that had nothing to do with her personally and everything to do with what she had inadvertently walked into. She did not feel satisfaction about this, exactly. She felt something more complicated, the particular weight that came with being the person whose situation exposed something larger. She had not wanted to be that person. She had wanted to be a nurse at Kettner Memorial with a flickering light in Bay 2 and a dog who got walked by her neighbor and an unremarkable old car that she drove home at midnight without incident. She had built that life deliberately, and it had served her, and she missed it already with a specificity that surprised her. Thibodeau was watching her. "Say it," he said. "I'm not saying it. You're thinking it loudly." She looked at her left hand again. The sling was uncomfortable, and her shoulder was running a constant low-grade complaint that she was processing in the background. And she was also running a fever, 100.2 when Bev checked at noon, which was within expected range for a post-op day 1, but added a quality of unreality to the afternoon that she could have done without. "I'm thinking that 63 suppressed complaints means 63 people who went through whatever version of last night I went through and didn't have a monitoring flag in a federal database and an Adler to make calls before sunrise," she said. "And most of them probably didn't have the outcome of having anyone find out what actually happened." "No," Thibodeau said. "They probably didn't." "So the thing I'm feeling isn't satisfaction," she said. "It's more like I'm looking at what luck looks like from the inside, and it's uncomfortable." "You're alive and your shoulder is fixable, and the people who did this are currently watching their careers catch fire," Thibodeau said. "That's allowed to matter." "I know it's allowed." She looked at the ceiling. "Doesn't mean it sits clean." He didn't argue with that because he understood it and because arguing with it would have been a form of condescension, and he had known her too long for that. Calloway had been in a room in the department annex since 10 that morning. Not detained. Technically, He was there voluntarily, for his own protection, which was how Rourke had framed it when he'd asked him to come in. The room had a table and 2 chairs and a window that looked onto the parking structure, and someone had brought him a sandwich at noon that he had eaten about a third of. He was 26 years old, and he had been sitting with what he had done for 14 hours. And the thing about sitting with something for 14 hours was that the story you told yourself about it started to develop cracks. He had told himself, on the road, that he had perceived a threat. He had told himself, in the first hour, that the situation had escalated and he had responded as trained. He had told himself, in the report, that her movement was sudden and her intentions were unclear, and that the discharge was a reasonable response to a perceived danger. He had been telling himself versions of this on a loop for 14 hours, and the loop was beginning to sound like what it was. He had shot a woman who was holding a wallet with 2 fingers. He knew this. He had known it at 11:48 p.m. when he was still standing on the gravel and the ambulance wasn't there yet. He had known it while Priya Okafor applied pressure with shaking hands, and the woman's voice came out of her steady and clinical, talking Okafor through what to do. He had filed the report anyway because Rourke had answered his call and said, "I'll handle it," and he had decided, in that gravel shoulder moment, to let Rourke handle it, and now he was sitting in a room watching the parking structure outside a window and understanding that the decision he had made in that moment was the second decision, and the second decision was the one that was going to define him more than the first. The knock on the door was Adler. Calloway looked at him. He had seen Adler in the building earlier, had watched him come through the lobby with the federal credentials and the woman investigator, and he had understood what it meant in an abstract way. Now it was concrete. Adler sat down across from him without preamble. He did not have a folder or a recording device on the table. He folded his hands. "I'm not here to take your statement," Adler said. "That's not my role in this. I'm here because I want you to understand the full shape of what you're in, because I think some part of what happened last night was a 26-year-old making a bad decision in a high-stress moment, and some part of it was a department that had been teaching people how to make those decisions for 9 years without consequence." Calloway said nothing. "That context matters for how this gets adjudicated," Adler said. "It doesn't erase the decision, but it's context." "She had her hands up," Calloway said. He said it quietly, looking at the table. Not as a confession. It had no performed weight to it. More like a man putting something down he'd been carrying wrong. "I know," Adler said. "I panicked." His voice was flat. I've thought about it for 14 hours and I don't have a better explanation than that." She was calm, and I wasn't. And I panicked. "Your department gave you a precedent," Adler said. "You knew, from 14 months of watching how this department operated, that if something went sideways, you could construct a narrative and it would hold. That knowledge doesn't cause a panic, but it shapes what happens in the 2 minutes after one." Calloway looked at him. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Adler said. "It's supposed to make you accurate about what happened. There's a difference." He stood up. "Federal counsel is going to contact you this afternoon. I'd advise you to be as accurate with them as you just were with me." He left. In the hallway, he passed Hoff, Rourke's union counsel, who was on his phone and looked at Adler with the expression of a man who had been navigating institutional crisis long enough to recognize when the tide had shifted past the point where navigation was useful. Adler kept walking on. The press arrived at 2:40 p.m. Not the local paper. That came later. The first vehicle was a satellite truck from the regional affiliate, which meant someone had made a call that Adler hadn't yet identified, and the second was a correspondent from a national outlet who had been covering civil rights cases for 6 years, and who had a source inside the federal system that Quirk was going to want to find eventually, but that was a problem for another day. They set up on the sidewalk outside the annex with the efficiency of people who had done it enough times to have a system. The duty sergeant came out and told them they were on public property, which they knew, and which was why they'd stopped exactly at the property line. And he went back inside and called Rourke, and Rourke stood at his window and looked at the satellite truck and understood that the container he'd been building around this situation for the past 16 hours had stopped being a container. Farrow called him at 2:55 p.m. Her voice was unchanged from the morning meeting, even informational, carrying nothing extra. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is holding a press briefing at 4 o'clock, she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me rather than from the truck outside your building." "What are they releasing?" "A general statement about a federal civil rights investigation involving the sheriff's department. No names at this stage. But Dylan, the database information is going to be part of the public filing, and once it is, the names are going to come from the press side because those are public records the moment they hit the federal court system. He looked at the satellite truck, at the correspondent talking to a camera with the annex building visibly centered in the background, at the people who had started gathering on the sidewalk. Not a crowd, but the beginning of one. People who had been near enough to see the trucks and stopped because satellite trucks meant something was happening. "Judith," he said. "Yes." "Is there anything—" He stopped. The question he was about to ask was one he already knew the answer to, had known the answer to since Quirk put the summary on the table in front of him, had probably known the answer to since 6 that morning when Garver told him the footage had already been logged with federal credentials, and the look on Garver's face said what the words hadn't. "No," Farrow said. "There isn't, Bob." Voss came up to Lena's room at 3:30 p.m. and returned the identification card herself. She set it on the bedside table without ceremony. Lena looked at it. The laminate cracked at one corner, the unit designation she had carried for 6 years and kept for 4 more, without exactly knowing why. Maybe because some things you'd done became part of you, and losing the physical evidence of them felt like losing the thing itself, even when you'd been trying to be done with it. "Your Major Adler came and spoke with me this morning," Voss said. She stood at the foot of the bed with her hands in her coat pockets in the posture of someone who was visiting off the record. "He explained what the identification represents. I don't have the clearance to fully understand it, but I understand enough." "Thank you for holding it," Lena said. "I almost logged it to administration out of reflex," Voss said. "I've been doing this job for 19 years, and my reflex is procedure. It took me 2 seconds to override the reflex, and I want to be honest about the fact that it was 2 seconds and not immediate, because I think that's worth saying." Lena looked at her. "That's a more honest assessment than most people make. I'm a surgeon. I operate on people. If I can't be accurate about my own reaction time, I should find a different field." Something that was nearly a smile. "How's the shoulder looking clinically? You want the honest version or the reassuring version?" "I want the version you'd give yourself." Voss pulled the chair closer and sat. "Muscle damage is significant. You're going to have a real rehabilitation process, not a theoretical one. 4 to 6 months before you're back to full function, and that's with consistent, correct rehab work starting within the week. If you push it early, you will create scar tissue adhesions that will limit your range of motion long term." She paused. "The good news is the joint is intact and the nerve function is intact, and you are clearly the kind of person who does the correct thing with that information." "I'll do the rehab," Lena said. "I know you will." Voss stood. "There's also this." She reached into her coat and produced a folded printout. "Your department sent a formal notification to hospital administration about 30 minutes ago. It's a request for your patient records under a health information disclosure clause tied to an active investigation." Lena took the paper and read it. The request was signed by Deputy Commander Frank Selby. She looked at it for a long moment. Selby had signed this at 2:47 p.m. Quirk had frozen his system access at approximately 11:30 a.m., which meant Selby had signed this request from a terminal he couldn't log into anymore, which meant either he hadn't tried to log in yet, or he had tried, found the access blocked, and still filed the request from outside the system using his departmental credentials as a show of authority he no longer had. She thought about which of those was more likely, and landed, uncomfortably, on the second. "He's still running plays," she said. "That was my read," Voss said. "I'm not releasing your records. There's a federal patient protection notation on your file as of this morning that supersedes the departmental request. But I wanted you to know it was made." "Does Adler know?" "I texted him 30 seconds before I came up here." Lena set the printout on the table beside the identification card. 2 pieces of paper, very different weights. She looked at them both. "He's trying to get ahead of something," she said. "Selby. He's doing it because he's scared and because he's been in internal affairs for 4 years, and he knows what a federal evidence trail looks like, and he's trying to find something that gives him a counter-narrative." She paused. "That means he knows the database is compromised. He's guessing we're in it. Can you do anything with that?" "Adler can." She reached for her phone with her right hand. It was on the table. Thibodeau had brought it from the locker where her things had been held. She sent a text. Short, specific. "Selby filed for my medical records 247. He knows about the database. He's fishing. Move on him before he finds something to work with. 3 minutes passed. Adler's response. On it. Selby is being formally interviewed in 20 minutes. Don't worry about him. She set the phone down. Thibodeau, who had stepped out and come back in while Voss was there, poured himself more coffee from the insulated mug that he had apparently been refilling at some point, because it should have been empty 2 hours ago. Rest, he said. I'm resting. You're problem solving. I can do both. Lena. She looked at him. He was 53 years old and had spent most of his adult life in environments that cost people things they didn't get back. And he had the particular tiredness of someone who had given a great deal and known it was necessary and not regretted it, but also not pretended it was free. She knew him well enough to know that him saying her name in that register meant he was asking her to do something that was actually hard for her, not something easy that she was resisting for performance. 1/2 hour, she said. 2. 1. Deal, he said, which told her the negotiation had been the point, getting her to name a number and commit to it. He was better at this than she gave him credit for, and she gave him considerable credit. She lay back against the adjusted bed. The shoulder complained. She gave it its allotted portion of attention, and no more. Outside the window, the sky had gone from gray to a low, flat white that meant either clouds or late afternoon, and she couldn't tell which without seeing more of it, and it didn't matter, and she let her eyes close. She was almost at the edge of something that wasn't quite sleep when Thibodeau's phone buzzed. She heard him pick it up, heard the slight shift in his breathing that meant the message was not routine. She opened her eyes. He was looking at the phone with an expression she recognized from field work, the expression of someone who has just received information that is both significant and immediately actionable, and is in the first 2 seconds of deciding how to move. Ray, she said. He looked up. Adler found 3 more officers, he said, still active in the department. They saw things over the past 4 years and filed internal reports through Selby's office. He paused. All 3 reports were never logged, but Selby kept his own records, personal records, separate from the department system, which he stored on a personal drive that he apparently accessed from a department terminal, which means it's now part of the federal evidence extraction. Lena waited. One of the reports, Thibodeau said, is dated 8 months ago. An officer named Calloway, first use of force incident, civilian complaint, traffic stop. The complainant was a woman. He looked at her. The report was filed by Okafor. The room was very still. Okafor had filed a report 8 months ago. 8 months ago, when Calloway had his first documented incident. She had used the proper channel, Internal Affairs, Selby's office, and the report had been received and suppressed and never logged, which meant that when Calloway stopped Lena on Route 9, it was not his first time, and Okafor had known it was not his first time, and had already tried once to do something about it, and had been silenced in exactly the way that young officers in this department had been silenced for 9 years. She had not been on that gravel shoulder by accident, and Okafor had not been frozen by accident, and nothing about last night had been isolated or unprecedented, and the weight of that, of understanding the full architecture of it, settled over Lena in a way that was not anger and was not grief, but was something that occupied the space where both of those things lived. She filed a report 8 months ago, Lena said. Yes. And then she was there last night. Yes. And she held the footage anyway. Yes. Thibodeau's voice was quiet. She held it and backed it up and said nothing to her supervisors and drove to a diner to meet a stranger at 6 in the morning because she had tried to do it the right way 8 months ago, and the right way had led nowhere, and she was not going to let that happen twice. Lena looked at the ceiling. Adler's next text came in at 4:03 p.m., 11 minutes after the U.S. Attorney's press briefing began 3 counties over. It was 4 words. Selby just asked for immunity. Selby asking for immunity meant Selby was willing to talk, which meant Selby understood the shape of what was coming and had calculated that the shape left him no room to stay quiet. Adler knew this. Quirk knew this. What it meant practically was that the man who had spent 4 years functioning as the department's pressure valve, receiving complaints and closing them, absorbing the evidence of what officers like Calloway did, and making it disappear into a filing system that no longer existed in any accessible form, was now going to describe, in exchange for reduced exposure, exactly how that system had worked and who had built it, and who had maintained it, and who had benefited from it. It meant Rourke. Quirk spent 40 minutes with Selby and his hastily acquired attorney in a room down the hall from where Rourke was still waiting for Hoff to finish his calls. She came out of the room with 4 pages of handwritten notes and an expression that Adler read as contained momentum. The look of someone who had just been handed the last structural piece of something and was now carrying it carefully. He documented everything, she said. Not in the department system. In a personal log he kept on a drive at home. Dates, names, complaint summaries, the instructions he received for each one. Instructions from Rourke. Verbal, mostly, but 3 of them are emails. Department email, which means they're already in the federal extraction. She looked at her notes. He was told, when he took the IA appointment, that his function was to protect the department's operational integrity. That's the phrase Rourke used, operational integrity. Selby understood what it meant and did the job and told himself it was normal, because the man who told him it was normal had 27 years of institutional authority behind him, and because the alternative was a career-ending conflict with a person who controlled the environment he worked in. Is that an excuse or an explanation? It's both, Quirk said, which is the honest answer, even if it's not the satisfying one. She was right, and Adler knew it, and he filed it in the category of things that were true and uncomfortable, and that he would need to sit with at some point when the case was finished, and he had time to sit with things. Right now, he did not have that time. He went to find Rourke. Rourke was alone when Adler came back into the conference room. Hoff had stepped out again. There had been a great deal of stepping out, which was its own communication. And Rourke was sitting with his hands flat on the table and the posture of a man who was no longer managing but waiting, which for someone who had been managing for 27 years was its own specific kind of deterioration. Adler sat across from him. He did not have the summary this time. He did not need it. Selby's cooperation agreement is being finalized, he said. His personal log documents 61 of the 63 suppressed complaints with direct instruction trail to your office. The other 2 have email records in the federal extraction. Rourke looked at him. His face was still composed. The composure was real, Adler thought, not performed. Some people held it together even when the thing they were holding together had already come apart, because the holding was a habit so deep it didn't require the original reason anymore. You built something that worked for a long time, Adler said. I'm not saying that to give you credit. I'm saying it because I think it's accurate and because I think you know it. And I think there's a version of you that genuinely believed you were protecting something. Operational integrity, department stability, whatever it was called internally. Rourke said nothing. But you also knew what Calloway did 6 weeks before last Tuesday, Adler said. Okafor's report came through Selby's office. Selby's log shows he briefed you. And you made a decision about what to do with that information, and then Calloway stopped a woman on Route 9 at 11:47 at night and shot her while she was holding her wallet, and you spent the next 6 hours trying to make that disappear too. The room was very quiet. I'd like to speak with my counsel, Rourke said. Of course, Adler said. He stood. He's in the hallway. He walked out and did not look back because there was nothing behind him that required looking at anymore. Brett Calloway was formally arrested at 5:22 p.m. on charges of excessive use of force and civil rights violation under federal statute. He did not resist. He had been sitting in the room with the parking structure view for 7 hours, and when the federal agents came in, he stood up with the expression of someone who had spent those 7 hours arriving at a destination he hadn't chosen and couldn't leave. Rourke was taken into federal custody at 6:08 p.m., walking out of the annex between 2 agents while the satellite truck filmed from the sidewalk, and the correspondent spoke into her camera with the building centered behind her, the way she had positioned it 6 hours earlier in anticipation of exactly this. He was in full uniform. He had not changed. Whether that was a choice or simply the result of a day that had moved too fast for incidental decisions, nobody knew. Selby surrendered his credentials and his personal drive at 6:15 p.m. as part of his cooperation agreement. He was escorted out through a side entrance, which was either a courtesy or a logistical choice, and probably both. Frank Hoff, the union counsel in the expensive suit, gave a brief statement to the press in which he said the union would be reviewing the circumstances of the arrests and supporting its members through the legal process, which was what union counsel said in these situations because there was nothing else to say. and he got into a car and drove away, and the press moved on to the camera angle that showed the annex entrance and the federal vehicles still parked across the front. Owen Kessel, who had been in the building all day and who had watched all of this unfold from the particular vantage point of someone who had done a small right thing and watched it grow into something he hadn't anticipated, stood in the lobby after the arrests and did not know what to do with his hands. He had them in his jacket pockets, and then at his sides, and then in his pockets again, which was what the body did when the mind was processing faster than the physical self could accommodate. Adler found him there. "Go home," he said. "Get some sleep. Someone from the U.S. Attorney's Office will contact you in the next 2 days about your formal witness role. You're protected. That's on record. Go home." Kessel nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something and was not sure what it was. "You did the right thing," Adler said, which was not something he said habitually, but this was a 25-year-old who needed to hear it stated plainly, and Adler was capable of recognizing when plain statement was the right tool. Kessel nodded again and walked out, and Adler watched him go, and then he picked up his phone and called Thibodeau. The call came through on speaker so Lena could hear it. She had been awake for the past 2 hours. The 1 hour she'd agreed to had extended naturally, because her body had more to say about the day than her mind had given it credit for. And she was sitting up with the shoulder sling repositioned slightly because the original angle had been creating a secondary strain in her neck that was going to become a problem if she didn't address it. She heard Adler's voice, and the cadence of it told her the shape of what he was going to say before he said it. He gave her the sequence in order: Calloway, Rourke, Selby, the press. He gave her the timeline and the charges and the cooperation agreement and Kessel's witness status. He spoke for about 3 minutes without interruption, and when he finished, there was a pause. "The federal case is going to take time," he said. "Months, probably. There will be depositions and hearings and things that require your formal participation. I want to be upfront about that. This doesn't end today. It ends today for them, in terms of their ability to keep operating, but the legal process is what it is." "I know how legal processes work," Lena said. "I know you do." Another pause. Outside the window, the sky had gone dark. At some point she hadn't tracked. "Your file is going to be part of the federal record," he said. "The sealed portion. It'll be in the case documentation. It'll be referenced in the civil rights claim. I can manage how much of it becomes publicly accessible, but some of it will come out in the proceedings." She had known this was coming since she signed the authorization form. She had made the decision then, and she was not going to revisit it from a hospital bed at 7 in the evening when her shoulder hurt and her fever was still tracking above baseline. The decision was made. She lived with her decisions. "Okay," she said. "Lena." "Cole." He stopped. She didn't use his first name often enough that it didn't carry weight when she did. "Thank you," she said. It was 2 words, and she meant them the way she meant everything. Without decoration, without performance, in the register of someone who understood the full value of what she was acknowledging. "You didn't have to move that fast." A pause on his end. "Yes, I did," he said, and hung up. Thibodeau set the phone down. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, which was the right call. And after a while he picked up his insulated mug and found it was actually empty this time, and went to find coffee and left her alone in the room. She sat in the quiet. There was a particular kind of quiet that came after things were settled that felt different from the quiet of waiting. She had experienced it before, in the field, at the end of operations that had gone on long enough to feel permanent, when the noise stopped and the stillness arrived, and you had to recalibrate to the fact that the thing that had been requiring everything from you no longer required anything. That recalibration was never instant. It always felt slightly wrong, slightly too large, like wearing a coat that fit yesterday and was somehow different today. She was not all right yet. She knew this without needing to examine it. Her shoulder was damaged and her fever was real, and she was going to be in this building for at least 4 more days and then in a rehabilitation process that was going to take months. And at the end of it, she was going to return to a life she hadn't fully decided the shape of yet, because the ordinary life she'd been building had been interrupted in a way that changed it, and she was honest enough with herself to admit she didn't know exactly what it looked like from here. But she was alive, and the people who had shot her and then lied about it were in federal custody, and 63 people, at minimum, whose complaints had been absorbed and discarded by a system that had decided their voices were manageable, were now part of a federal case file that could not be managed in the same way. And Priya Okafor had held 17 seconds of video on her phone for 14 hours in the face of everything the department had, and had been willing to stand in front of federal attorneys and say exactly what she saw. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the specific weight of something. Okafor came to the hospital on the third day. She had been debriefed, formally, by the U.S. Attorney's team, and she had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, which was protocol and not punitive, as her federal attorney had explained, but which still felt strange because she had not missed a shift in 14 months, except for illness, and this was not illness. She had been at home for 2 days in the particular limbo of someone whose situation was resolved in the large sense and still actively unresolved in the daily sense. And on the third morning, she got in her car and drove to Kettner Memorial. She asked for Lena at the nursing station. Bev looked at her. The uniform she was wearing was civilian clothes, not the department uniform, and without it, she looked younger than her role had made her seem, and told her room number. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she came in. Lena was at the window in a recliner that someone had sourced from somewhere. Thibodeau's doing, probably, because the bed had been making her shoulder position worse, and he was the kind of person who solved problems quietly and didn't report them. Her left arm was in the sling, and she had a paperback open in her right hand that she wasn't fully reading, and when she looked up at Okafor in the doorway, she closed the book. "Sit down," Lena said. Okafor sat in the chair that Thibodeau usually occupied. She looked at Lena with the expression of someone who had been thinking about what they were going to say and had arrived at the conclusion that what they were going to say was not adequate and were going to say it anyway. "I filed a report 8 months ago," she said. "I know," Lena said. "I used the right channel. I did what you're supposed to do. And it went nowhere, and then—" She stopped. Her hands were in her lap. "I was on scene within seconds. I heard the shot, and I ran. And I saw your hands, and I knew what I was looking at. And I froze for a moment, which I told Adler and I told the federal attorneys, and I'm telling you now because I think you're the one it matters to tell." "It was a moment," Lena said. "A moment is not the same as a failure. You talked me through it while you were bleeding. You needed direction. I had it. That's what you do with what you have." Okafor looked at her. "I should have screamed 8 months ago, not through the proper channel. Actually screamed, to someone who couldn't make it disappear." Lena considered this. She thought about what she would say to a patient who was sitting with a decision they'd made under incomplete information in an environment that had been specifically constructed to make the right decision feel impossible. She thought about what was true versus what was kind, and whether there was a version where both could occupy the same sentence. "You were 14 months into a department that had been managing people like you for 9 years, Lena said. You filed the report you were supposed to file because you were a person trying to do the right thing inside a system that was designed to absorb the right thing and neutralize it. The 8 months is not something you carry. What you do with the space after it, that's yours." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "What happens to me now?" she said. It was not entirely a question. "What do you want to happen?" "I want to still be a law enforcement officer." She said it steadily, like something she'd tested for structural integrity. "I want to do it in a department where doing it correctly is possible." "I don't know if that's naive." "It's not naive," Lena said. "It's specific. Specific is harder to dismiss than idealistic." She shifted her arm in the sling. "Adler's going to want to talk to you about a position with the CID investigative team. Federal, not county. He mentioned it to Thibodeau." She paused. "I'm not speaking for him, but I'm telling you it's coming." Okafor absorbed this. Something shifted in her posture. Not relief exactly, but the particular adjustment of someone who has been carrying weight at a certain angle and has just been offered a different configuration. "Why are you telling me before he does?" "Because you came here," Lena said, "and I think you needed to know before you left." Okafor nodded slowly. She looked at her hands in her lap and then looked up. "I watch the footage sometimes," she said. "The 17 seconds. I've watched it probably 40 times since that night." "What do you see?" "I see someone who was calm when I wasn't." She met Lena's eyes. "I see someone who understood exactly what was happening to her and decided to survive it by staying completely present in it, every second of it." Lena said nothing. The window behind her showed the parking structure and a piece of sky that was doing something complicated with late afternoon light, going from white to pale orange at the edges. "I didn't decide anything," Lena said finally. "It was just what I knew how to do. That's different from a decision." "Maybe," Okafor said, "but you knew how to do it, and you did." "What?" The federal indictments came down 6 weeks later. Brett Calloway was charged with civil rights violation, resulting in bodily harm, excessive use of force, and filing a false official report. Captain Dylan Rourke was charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy to suppress civil rights complaints, and abuse of official authority. 9 counts, covering a documented pattern that stretched back 8 years. Frank Selby entered a cooperation agreement and faced 3 counts of obstruction, reduced from 6 in exchange for his testimony, which his attorney negotiated with the precision of someone who understood exactly what Selby was worth as a witness and exactly how much of that worth could be converted to leniency. The charges were filed on a Tuesday morning. The U.S. attorney held a press conference. The satellite truck was back outside the annex, but the annex was already under interim federal oversight, and the interim director, a woman brought in from outside the county specifically because she had no prior relationship with the department, made a statement alongside the U.S. attorney that used the phrases accountability and structural reform and the people this department is meant to serve in an order that felt deliberate and was. Owen Kessel was retained as a deputy under the interim structure. He was not promoted. He was not given a commendation. He went back to his shifts and did his job, which was what he had wanted to do when he started, and which felt different now. Not easier, but more legible. Understood the environment he was in a way he hadn't before, and that understanding was uncomfortable and also clarifying, and he had decided to stay because leaving felt like giving the department to whatever came next without anyone in it who remembered what had happened. That was his reasoning, and he knew it wasn't simple, and he didn't claim it was. The 63 suppressed complaints became 63 reopened cases. Not all of them would result in prosecution. Some were too old, some lacked surviving documentation, some complainants could not be located or declined to re-engage with a process that had already failed them once. But 21 of them had enough preserved evidence to move forward, and the U.S. Attorney's Office assigned a team specifically to that work, and the team was thorough, and the process was slow, and it was real. Lena was discharged from Kettner Memorial on day 6. Her shoulder was not healed, it was stable, and the infection that had threatened briefly on day 3 had been caught and treated, and Voss had given her a discharge summary that was 3 pages long and very specific about the rehabilitation protocol, which Lena read twice before signing. The rehab clinic was 40 minutes from her apartment. She had already called them and made the first 4 appointments because doing it before discharge was more efficient than doing it after, and efficiency was how she managed her own recovery the same way it was how she managed everything else. Thibodeau drove her home. He carried the bag she hadn't packed herself because she'd been in a hospital gown when she arrived, and Diane had brought clothes from her apartment and left them at the nursing station without being asked, because Diane was that kind of neighbor, and Lena had never fully acknowledged how much she relied on that. The drive home was quiet in the good way. Thibodeau didn't fill silence unnecessarily. The Civic, her car, was still on the shoulder of Route 9, and the county had agreed to have it towed to a repair facility as part of the civil settlement process that was running parallel to the criminal case, which meant she would get it back in some weeks, and in the meantime Diane had offered her a spare vehicle and she had accepted. Her apartment was the way she left it, small, organized, the dog immediately demanding attention in the particular way that dogs demanded attention from people who had been gone unexpectedly long, with a quality of urgency that was also transparently joyful. Lena sat on the floor for several minutes and let it happen because her shoulder could accommodate sitting on the floor and because the dog was not wrong about the urgency. Thibodeau made tea, which she hadn't asked for and didn't object to. He stayed for 2 hours and then said he was heading back. He had a drive ahead of him, and he stood at the door in the way people stood at doors when they had more to say than they were going to say. "You know where I am," he said. "I know where you are," she said. He left. She heard the car start and then fade. She sat in her apartment with the dog on her feet and the tea going cool and the shoulder sending its regular communique, which she acknowledged and set aside. She had been a nurse at Kettner Memorial for 3 years, and she was going to go back to it when the rehabilitation was done. When Voss cleared her, when her range of motion returned to a functional level. She knew this with the same flatness she knew most things about herself. Not as a dramatic choice, not as a statement of anything, just as the next accurate thing. She was good at the work. The work mattered. The flickering light in Bay 2 was presumably still flickering, but she also knew, sitting in the quiet of her apartment on the first evening back, that the shape of what she was going to do had expanded. Adler had asked, not formally, not yet, but in the way that Adler asked things when he was testing the ground before committing to a path. Whether she would consider a consulting role with a federal program being developed to support service members and veterans who encountered civil rights violations in civilian contexts. A small program, underfunded, still in its structural phase. The kind of work that was mostly unglamorous and largely invisible, and occasionally the difference between someone like Okafor having a number to call and not having one. She hadn't answered him. She was going to say yes. She knew this the way she'd known most things that mattered. Not from deciding, but from finding herself already there, the decision already made somewhere she hadn't consciously occupied. She would be a nurse at Kettner, and she would do the federal consulting work, and she would do the rehabilitation, and in 4 to 6 months her shoulder would be close to what it had been, and she would drive a car again on roads at midnight without it meaning anything. And Harwick County would be rebuilding under interim federal oversight, and Callaway would be in a federal courtroom, and Rourke would be in a federal courtroom, and 63 people who had been told their experience of this institution was not real would have documentation that said otherwise. None of this was clean. There was no version where it was clean. A woman had been shot on a highway for having the wrong car and the wrong clothes and the wrong quality of stillness at the wrong moment, and the system that had shot her had spent 16 hours trying to make it disappear. And the only reason it hadn't was a monitoring flag, and a man who drove through the night, and a young officer who downloaded footage before anyone told her to. And that was not a foundation you could feel fully good about. Too much had depended on too much coincidence. There were 100 versions of Tuesday night where the calculation worked the other way. That was the thing that stayed with her. Not the shoulder, not the gravel, not the shot. The 100 versions. She thought about those people in those 100 versions. The ones for whom the monitoring flag didn't exist, or the former commander was unreachable, or the young officer made a different call at 3 in the morning. The ones who ended up in a different kind of quiet, months later, with a closed case file and a department that had moved on and a story that the institution had decided was already resolved. She thought about what it meant that she was not one of those people and what that obligated her to, and she did not arrive at a clean answer because clean answers were not the architecture she operated in. What she arrived at was this: she was still here. The work was still here. The next person who needed what she had to offer was, in some specific and as yet undetermined future, going to need it, and she was going to be in a position to give it, and that was not a resolution or a lesson or an ending. It was just the next true thing. The dog shifted on her feet. The tea was cold. The apartment was the same as she'd left it. She had been underestimated because of what she looked like and where she worked and how quietly she moved through the world. The people who underestimated her had made decisions on the basis of that underestimation that had altered dozens of lives, not just hers, and they were now facing the weight of those decisions in federal courtrooms. She had not beaten them by being exceptional. She had survived by being trained and been found by being known and been believed by being specific, and the whole machinery of accountability that followed had required not one person, but many. Thibodeau driving 6 hours, Adler on a jacket pocket phone at 5:04 a.m. Okafor's hand steady on a download button at 3:00 in the morning, Kessel walking into a conference room and sitting down. That was the lesson, if there was one. Not that the quiet ones were secretly powerful all along. Not that strength announces itself eventually, just that the people who decide you are small, who make their calculations based on your clothes and your car, and your willingness to stay calm in moments that would break most people. Those people are making an error, and errors compound, and eventually the thing they were trying to contain is larger than the container they built. She reached for the cold tea and drank it anyway. Outside, Harwick County was doing what it did. The ordinary continuation of a place. People finishing dinner and walking dogs and driving home on roads that were dark past the grain facility because the county still hadn't replaced those lights. Ordinary life in the same geography, where something that had been wrong for 9 years had finally, slowly, at considerable cost to people who shouldn't have had to pay it, stopped. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. It was what there was, and she was still here to see it, and she intended to stay.